Earlier in the year, my brother gave me this Cosina CSL camera, made by Cosina in Japan somewhere in the late 70s. Of course, I was aware of Cosina lenses and cameras, but I'd never really paid them any attention before that. Cosina was established in 1959 and began making cameras and lenses. Over the years, they did make products under their own brand name, but they also manufactured a large amount for other brands. For instance, the CSL and CSM, which are more or less the same camera, were also sold as the Vivitar XC-3 and the Porst Compact Reflex. Moving forward to the 80s, and the Miranda MS1 Super was just a rebadged version of the Cosina CT1 Super. And the oddball in Canon's T-series of cameras, the T60, was also a derivative of the Cosina CT1, albeit with somewhat more restyling so it wasn't quite so obvious. This one is in the camera spa at the moment, but I'll do a video on it at some point once it's back working. There were also cameras made for Petri, Olympus and Nikon based around the same chassis. I think it's the Nikon FM10 that's identical to the Canon T60 when you remove the bottom cover. The thing that surprised me the most when I was gathering information about Cosina is that they manufacture the new Voigtlander lenses which many people rave about. That's a genius move, getting hold of a premium name like Voigtlander if you're planning to sell relatively high-end lenses. Anyway, back to the CSL. It's an interesting little camera. By 1977, or thereabouts, when the CSL was released, many manufacturers had opted for bayonet lens mounts, whereas the CSL gave you some of the up-to-date features, like electronic shutter timing, whilst retaining the good old M42 screw mount. This would have been quite attractive if you were looking for something a little more modern, but you didn't want to replace your existing lens collection. The CSL is smaller and lighter than earlier cameras, such as the Pentax Spotmatic, at 545 and 637 grams respectively. In fact, it's not so far off the size of the Olympus OM10, although that one is a bit lighter at only 430 grams. There are of course a few cost-cutting exercises visible, such as the name badges only being screen printed onto the case rather than being embossed and painted. 2 out of 3 of my examples are starting to lose their identity already. On the front of the camera is the self-timer lever. Unlike old mechanical cameras, this doesn't operate a clockwork timer. In fact, if I try to operate the lever without advancing the film first, it simply won't latch. Once the film has been advanced, the lever will latch in place and you can press the shutter button to begin the countdown. There's no whirring of the timer, just a blinking light to indicate that the timer is active. The shot will be taken around 8 seconds later. As far as I can make out, there's no way of cancelling the self-timer once you've set it, so you'll just have to wait for the camera to fire. Thusly. Beneath that is the stop-down reset button. When you half-press the shutter button, the lens is stopped down to the value set on the aperture ring and the exposure meter is turned on. If you decide you're not ready to take the shot, you can reset the aperture to fully open by pressing this button. Over on the other side are 2 electrical sockets. The bottom one is for electronic flash guns, but the upper one isn't for the old flash bulbs, as you might expect to find on old cameras like the Pentax Spotmatic. I'll talk more about the upper socket later in the video. On the top of the camera is the flip-out film rewind crank, which pulls up in the usual manner to release the film back. Then there's the film plane index mark next to that and a hot shoe in the centre. Over on the right is the combined shutter speed and film speed dial. Lift up the outer ring and rotate it to select film speeds between 25 ISO and 3200 ISO, then release it to lock it in that position. Now, without lifting the ring, rotate the knob to select shutter speeds from 4 seconds to 1/1000th of a second. Access to those longer shutter speeds is a definite bonus of the electronic shutter control. Beyond 1/1000th is M and bulb. Bulb is fully mechanical and the shutter will remain open until you release the shutter button. The M position is a mechanical shutter speed that should get you out of trouble if your batteries are flat. This shoots at around 1/50th of a second. If I remove the batteries and set any speed on the dial, I'll go for 1/15th of a second, and press the shutter button with the back door open, you'll see that the second curtain moves at the same time as the front curtain, so the film won't be exposed at all, even if it sounds like the shutter is firing. If I now set the dial to M and repeat this process, this time you'll see that we do actually get an exposure. Except that it's too fast for the frame rate on my camera, so you'll just have to take my word for that. As is the case with a fair few film cameras, the light meter can't read below a certain EV level, so if you select the faster film speeds, you can no longer turn the shutter speed dial to the slowest speeds because they're out of metering range. For example, if I set the film speed to 3200, the slowest shutter speed I can now select is 1/4 of a second. Next to the shutter speed knob is the shutter release button, with the usual cable release thread in the centre. Press this halfway down to stop down the aperture and turn on the exposure meter, and the rest of the way to release the shutter itself. Surrounding the stem of the shutter button is a lever with two positions, A and L. This is just a shutter lock, so you can't accidentally trigger the shutter if you've left the film advanced when you put the camera in your bag. The letter L is for locked and A is apparently for advance. It's a pity they missed a trick here, because on some cameras you can use the shutter lock to lock the shutter open in bulb mode, allowing you to do long exposures without a cable release, but that's only a minor grumble. Behind that is the rewind release button, which latches down, allowing you to rewind the film. It pops back up automatically once you've put a new film in. Beside this is the film advance lever. There's not much to say about it, apart from the fact it feels quite smooth and refined, and as with many cameras, it rests slightly away from the camera body for easy access, and then you can push it back in for storage. Finally on the top is a frame counter, which auto resets when you open the film door. On the bottom is the tripod socket, not exactly in the centre, but at least it's not all the way over to the side. And the battery hatch, which takes two SR44 batteries, or LR44 if you don't mind a slightly less stable voltage curve. These are installed with the plus side facing towards you as you insert them. I'm not sure if all copies of the CSL have the memo holder on the back door. These are really useful, as I generally have over 10 cameras loaded with film at any time, and it's a bit tricky remembering what film is in what camera at times. Neither of my copies of the CSM has that memo holder. Loading a film is pretty standard stuff. Pull up the rewind crank to open the back, drop in your roll of film, and push the rewind crank back in, giving it a little turn so the drive dog engages with the film canister. Pull the film leader across and slot the end into one of the slots in the take-up spool. You can rotate the spool by hand if the slot isn't quite accessible. Advance the film, making sure it doesn't slip out of the take-up spool and that the perforations are engaged with the teeth in the drive sprocket, and fire the shutter. Assuming the film is sitting flat along the film guides, you can now close the back. Take up any slack in the film by rotating the rewind crank gently in the direction of the arrow. Advance the film while watching the rewind crank. It should rotate in the opposite direction to the arrow, indicating that the film is being pulled through the camera correctly. Fire the shutter, and then advance once more and fire the shutter again to get rid of any exposed film from loading the camera. And then you're ready to go out and shoot some photos. When you've finished the film, press the rewind button, flip out the rewind crank, and gently rewind the film into the canister. You should feel the tension ease as the film releases from the take-up spool. If you're not planning to process the film yourself, you can carry on winding a few more turns to make sure the film is completely in the canister. Open the door and remove the canister. The Viewfinder has a split image focus assist in the centre with a microprism around the outside of that. When you half press the shutter button, the lens is stopped down and the exposure meter is turned on. It's fairly simple. If the plus arrow on the left is illuminated, your shot will be overexposed, and you'll either need to stop down the lens some more or increase the shutter speed, until you get a green blob in the middle. If the minus arrow on the right is illuminated, the shot will be underexposed, so you'll need to open up the aperture some more, or select a slower shutter speed until the green blob is illuminated again. Of course, you can take the shot at any time you want by fully pressing the shutter button, regardless of what the meter tells you. Okay, time for a quick break, and then we can look at a few of the shots taken on the CSL. Although if you've already seen my first video looking at Harman Phoenix film, you'll have already seen these, so I won't make the gallery too long this time. After that, I'll bring out one of the coolest features of this camera. As I said earlier, the CSL and its siblings, the CSM and the CSR, offer some relatively up-to-date technology for M42 lens owners. The CSR, which I don't have a copy of, also offered switchable average or spot metering, but apart from that it's largely the same. But there's one additional feature: aperture priority auto exposure. Albeit you'll need an extra little gizmo for this. The Cosina AEC Adapter, your friendly little robot that perches on top of the camera taking care of the shutter speeds for you. Firstly, insert a 4LR44 6V battery into the battery chamber, positive side pointing towards the door. Then set the shutter speed on the camera to whatever speed is indicated on the AEC adapter. There should be a little lever on top of the adapter to raise the drive shaft as you insert it onto the hot shoe, but that's missing on my unit, so I just use a fingernail. Jiggle the shutter speed dial a little until the drive shaft drops into place. Gently tighten the thumb wheel to lock the unit onto the hot shoe, and plug the cable into the mystery socket above the flash sync socket. And now you're all set for aperture priority auto exposure. Advance the film in the usual manner, press the shutter button halfway, and wait until the motor stops turning and the green blob is illuminated. You can take a look at the chosen speed and adjust the aperture if you're not happy, then half press the shutter button again and the unit will adjust the speed accordingly. Once you've taken the shot, the unit is inactive until you advance the film again. Manual override is a little long-winded. You basically remove the AEC adapter and set the speed by hand. It might not be the best system in the world, but it's the quirkiness that makes it interesting, and I think it's really great. I didn't use the AEC adapter for the first film that I put through the camera, but I will give it a try in my future role. As a fully manual camera, it's easy to use and all the controls are in the right place. There's something about the viewfinder that makes it a little difficult to see through clearly. I have a few cameras like that. Maybe it's something to do with the magnification they chose for the viewfinder. At the time you could probably get diopter lenses to clip onto the eyepiece, but you'd probably be hard pushed to find one now. I made my own correction lens for my Nikon EM. It's just part of a pair of reading glasses inserted into a 3D printed holder. I might do the same thing for the CSL because the last one worked really well. One other weird thing I found was the lens that I plan to use with this camera, a 50mm Yashinon f1.7, hits the mirror when it's set to infinity, or rather the mirror hits it. I would have expected all M42 mount lenses to work okay, but obviously that isn't the case. Anyway, I then got the second CSM, which came with the Cosina 50mm f1.7, so I cleaned that one up and popped it on the CSL. I didn't try all of my M42 lenses, but of the ones I tried, the Yashinon lenses were the only ones that interfered with the mirror. There were a few things to fix on the camera when I first got it. Light seals, mirror bumper foam, general cleanup, and the leatherette was peeling off in several places. But before I could do any of that, I needed to get the film door open, but the latch was jammed solid, and I didn't want to pull too hard on the rewind knob in case something broke. I managed to ease the catch into the open position, possibly from the bottom of the camera, but I can't remember now. There was then a side plate covering the door catch, which once removed revealed the problem. Someone had attempted to reattach the peeling leatherette by pouring superglue onto the camera. This had made its way into the door catch mechanism and solidified there. You can see it in this photo of the catch cover plate. There's an almost complete layer of dried superglue. Luckily the glue didn't take to the moving section of the latch, so although it jammed up, the parts weren't actually bonded together. I used a combination of superglue remover and scraping to gradually remove the residue. It goes without saying that the glue had done nothing to stick the leatherette in place, which was still flapping in the breeze. The other repair was on the self-timer lever. When the self-timer lever latches, a metal lever sits on the shoulder of this nylon cam. But you remember that I said there was no way to cancel the self-timer once you'd set it? Well, I think someone must have forced it, and it took a chunk out of the cam, creating a ramp rather than a shoulder, which the metal lever just slipped off. I was able to slightly bend the metal lever so it sat on the remaining good side of the shoulder, and now the self-timer works as it should. I think that's probably about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.